Beyond the Bubble, Free Speech Rights. Take 1, 2, 3, 4.
Kia ora koutou, ka nui te mihi kia koutou katoa, kia tātou I tēnei rangi. Today we're excited to be launching into a discussion about the right to free speech. So I'd like for us in our conversation today to be thinking about where those limits are and to explore this kaupapa. We are lucky enough to be joined today by Professor Peter Lineham, Thalia, Kehoe, Rowden, and of course we're also joined by Professor Paul Morris, so no mai haramai ki a koe hoki. Peter, if I might start with you, when we're trying to work out what the limits are to this right of free speech, what it is and what its limits are, we know there are some limits, right? We know there are kind of legal limits on what we can say in public and what we can't say in public. But thinking back to the comments by Israel Folau, you spoke publicly at the time defending his right to say what he did, despite the fact that his comments were deemed, and some really were, very offensive and hurtful, perhaps even harmful. Do you want to talk to us a bit more about how you came to that position?
Yeah, so the issue of how much free speech should one allow is a really perplexing one. But with Israel Folau's one, I mean, it reminded me that the issue can be personal. Because as a gay male, I mean, he was threatening me with hell, which I didn't altogether appreciate, and which I would certainly want to reject utterly the logic and the way in which he justified his views. But it's one thing to disagree with a person. What troubled me at the time very much was the declaration by a lot of people in my community that this was hate speech, that it shouldn't be allowed. Because I felt, well, you know, it's only yesterday that his views would have been the standard orthodoxy of most of the society for a start. It's amazing how quickly views shift. Secondly, that at that time, for me to have stood up and said something as he stood up and said against the current consensus, well, frankly, I wouldn't have had the guts to have said that. Far too risky. I think, in a way, that free speech always trumps the opposition, except at the point where it deliberately threatens violence against others. I think if we're going to have a healthy society, look, in the end, we're going to have to live with difference. And this is what really concerns me whenever free speech is debated in New Zealand, that we so quickly move towards a situation where the current orthodoxy becomes everything and no other views should be allowed. Well, in that case, we don't actually have a democracy.
Do you think then that there is a way of protecting the vulnerable? Because you're speaking today as somebody who is kind of confident and able to speak in the public eye, but there are a number of young people, for example, who might have been severely affected by hearing those words. And there could be harm that could happen in those young people's lives.
I think it's very clear that freedom of speech, always the extreme ends of it have a potential of inciting violence. I think one actually has to look at intention to determine whether, in fact, the person can be held accountable for the violence that results. If there was an intention of inciting violence, I know that would be a hard thing to prove.
Very hard.
Then quite clearly it can't be allowed. We cannot have a society where things are decided by violence. I might say in other cases of freedom of speech in New Zealand recently, I mean, Māori have felt threatened. And there's been very interesting discussions around Māori feeling as though there's a coercive intent in the Southern Molyneux views. It was so racially charged. But I'd still say that then actually the law has to come in and protect the vulnerable as well as protecting free speech. In other words, it has to put guards or put compensations or put support around those who are threatened, while at the same time guarding the right of freedom of speech of those who might impugn them.
Kia ora. Thalia, I'm thinking back to 2015 where you were successful in your complaint to the Advertising Standards Authority about the use of a billboard with the image of a naked woman on it, and you we're successful in saying that breached standards, advertising standards. And part of that was to do, I think, with the creation of rape culture, or the upholding of rape culture, even if that wasn't in the minds of the advertisers themselves. So how do you feel about this problem of allowing certain things to be said and done that promote a culture that then leaves people vulnerable?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that freedom of speech has never been an absolute right. The right to be free from torture is absolute. You can't allow a little bit of torture, and we can't say it's okay for one or two people to be tortured. But the rights to freedom of speech and expression have never been absolute like that. We've always, as a society, had things that we value and that we therefore place limits on freedom of expression. So I think it's an open conversation for us to decide what we value. And what we have valued in the past, and then allowed exceptions for. For instance, we've been very good at protecting the public reputations of rich men with our defamation laws because we've valued those. And I think it's up to us to decide that we might like to value the dignity of vulnerable populations in our society and redraw the boundaries. I think that's a reasonable thing to do.
So what would you do to redraw those boundaries?
Well, I think expanding Section 61 to include other vulnerable groups would be a sensible and reasonable thing to do. So we've done that already, 30 years ago in the Human Rights Act, but as you say, only on race, colour, national, ethnic origins. And I think it would be sensible to expand that to hate speech against other vulnerable people.
Thalia, that'll still leave unclear, though, what actually is hate speech.
Oh, I absolutely agree.
Because, I'm all in favour, actually, of extending the law to protect other groups that are specifically protected under the Human Rights Act. It seems odd that it isn't at the moment. But even if that's there, it'll still need to define... freedom of speech is still allowed for in the Act. You have to prove hate. How do you do that?
Well, I think I would like to redraw the boundaries and redefine the harm that we're talking about.
Yeah.
You talked about inciting violence, and I think that we need to recognise that there's a very direct line between speech and action. And Lauren Southern's a good example of that because she was in the spotlight for her free speech ideas and for talking about racist ideas. But only a year or two before, she had been actively stopping search and rescue boats from going and reaching brown people who were drowning in the Mediterranean Sea. So there's a reasonably clear line there. She didn't need to incite violence. These things go together. It's not just violence in the streets that we ought to be concerned about. The ideas of rape culture and microaggressions, and the idea that children are growing up in Aotearoa with the beliefs around them telling them that they are of less worth than other children. I think that's a harmful thing that we need to take a bit more seriously.
Paul, I can see you wanting to jump in here.
I was wanting to come in. I find myself agreeing with both of these two wonderful people, but for profoundly different reasons. What occurred to me when you were speaking were two things. One simply is we have set the legal thresholds ridiculously high, whether it's digital communications, etc., and proving excitation or inciting violence has proved for the courts has been just too difficult. But I think there's the wrong way to go around it. Part of it is a part of a much larger debate that hasn't only been legal but been moral and ethical. It's that space that we need to open up. Otherwise, we can only get the Southern and Molyneux knee-jerk is we're doing it for free speech, and the price for my free speech is legitimate harm to you. Yesterday's Guardian Weekly got this lovely piece about Geert Wilders and the new competition for the most offensive Muhammad cartoon, €10,000 prize and 200 entries already. There was a march and a rally in Islamabad yesterday calling for jihad against the West because of this. After Charlie Hebdo, after the cartoon, after our own Wellington embrace of the cartoons and in 2006 here, we ought to create at least the possibility of thinking about what it means to repeatedly offend someone without actually looking at the causes of their offence or contextualising their offence in terms of free speech.
So there's a danger, isn't there, of decontextualising our discussion about rights from the society in which we live.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The Romans apparently had a solution in that the censor, the public censor in ancient Rome, had a responsibility of kind of sectioning people who were bringing the community's morals and values at risk. And so those people needed to be controlled. Rather than censoring what they said, they censored the people. Is that the sort of thing you're talking about?
No, well, no. That's an intriguing thing. I think that I have less problem with censorship than you two. I think we already have huge restrictions on freedom of expression and freedom of speech. We do it for decency, we rule out obscenity, we do it for advertising, we do it for honesty, we do it for privacy. It's not as if we don't regulate freedom of expression and freedom of speech. And I have no difficulties with that. The way I've been trying to think about it, is in terms of risk assessment. An appetite for risk. And this is spending too much time on governance boards. And so I think we need a very different sort of discussion. And the discussion is what the French call le vivre ensemble, to live together, and what it costs to live together. And we have to have a discussion that is broad and engaging and more inclusive, but ask questions about what are we happy with? Are we happy with condemning gay and lesbian people to hell? Are we happy with polygamy? Are we happy with full-face veils, which are banned in Denmark this week? Are we happy at drawing lines in this way? And what sort of harm is acceptable? But until we have this kind of discussion about risks about social cohesion, risks about exclusivity, but we haven't even begun to talk through what I would find acceptable and what you would and where we meet this.
So let's perhaps pick that up after a short break. Kia ora.